going through my PowerPoint, it really helped me sort of solidify what it is my goals are when I teach Frederick Douglass's narrative, and what I'm attempting to communicate to the students. I don't know that I always communicate it well, but I'm attempting to communicate it. As far as my own personal experience with the narrative and with Frederick Douglass as a historical figure, one of the greatest moments I ever had, one of the greatest opportunities I ever had, was for a summer. I taught for a program called Upward Bound. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's for first-generation college students, and they are invited to stay on a college campus for about 4 or 5 weeks and take college classes, right? And sort of to give them the experience to say, you can do this, right? First-generation college student might not have a family that has the ability to support them the way that they need to. So the program I taught with always saved the money they were budgeted, because they were given a certain budget, and they took that money and emphasized the trip. We did a week-long trip at the end of the program, and one of the years I taught, we went to Washington, D.C., and had a really wonderful tour guide who knew the city inside out. And one of the places we went to was Frederick Douglass's house on Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C., and I'll show you an image of it here. And I was, in preparation for this, and sometimes I watch it in preparation for class, that Cedar Hill serves as something of a midway point between Frederick Douglass's roots as a slave in Talbot, Maryland, to his experience, at the end of his life, working as an ambassador and working in the government. Right? So this house on Cedar Hill serves as something of a focal point between his birth as a slave versus the end of his life as an important American statesman and an important American historical figure. So, and here is a historical sign at Talbot County, and a few notes about Douglass's life at this historical mark. I have not been to this historical site, but yeah, and this is the house on Cedar Hill. I have been to this house, and it was a great trip, one of the most rewarding experiences I've had as a teacher, to be able to visit this house and the rest of the monuments in Washington, D.C. So the first aspect that I try to emphasize is the historical aspects of Douglass's narrative and Douglass as a historical figure. So he gives clear historical context about the brutality of slavery, the dehumanization that's involved in slavery. So his narrative reads in many ways as a historical document that shows the cruelty of slavery, shows the injustice of slavery. And what I've marked here are page numbers in the text that I'm using so that I can remember which pages I need to go to, because this is one of these things, as you can see from my notes here, every page is marked and everything because everything is important. So I've put page numbers up here to remind myself of some of the passages I need to look at. Right, and this is what I'm speaking of when I try to say, I feel my role in teaching any literary text, but especially Frederick Douglass's text, is try to emphasize his work as much as possible and stay out of the way as much as possible. Right, give the students a lane through which to interpret the work, but allow his voice to be the major voice in this work. So I try to point to passages as much as possible. So here you have in chapter 1. If you want to, if you have your hands on a copy at some point, this is in chapter 1, fairly early in the narrative, in which he talks about frequently before the child has reached its 12th month, its mother is taken from it and hired out on some farm a considerable distance off, and the child is placed under the care of an old woman, too old for field labor, For what this separation has done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection toward its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. Right? And here we have him speaking to the brutality of children separated from their parents, and purposefully so, right, to rob them of that connection, that parental connection. And later in chapter 4, we have this other very brutal description of a slave who is trying to escape a whipping named Demby. And I'm going to read this paragraph as well. It's so powerful, and it speaks, I'm going to talk in a second of Douglas's narrative as literary work. And these moments of brutal realism and how he describes how the slaves are treated. And here is one example. His savage barbarity was equaled only by the consummate coolness with which he committed the grossest and most savage deeds upon the slaves under his charge. Mr. Gore once undertook to whip one of Colonel Lloyd's slaves by the name of Demby. He had given Demby but few stripes when, to get rid of the scourging, he ran and plunged himself into a creek and stood there at the depths of his shoulders, refusing to come out. Mr. Gore told him that he would give him 3 calls, and that if he did not come out at the 3rd call, he would shoot him. The 1st call was given. Demby made no response, but stood his ground. The 2nd and 3rd calls were given with the same result. Mr. Gore then, without consultation or deliberation with anyone, not even giving Demby an additional call, raised his musket to his face, taking deadly aim at his standing victim, and in an instant poor Demby was no more. His mangled body sank out of sight, and blood and brains marked the water where he had stood. And so that closing image of the blood and brains in the water, where a once living person stood, right? All because he was trying to escape being whipped. He was trying to escape brutality, only to have more brutality done upon him. Right? So Douglas gives us this historical account, right? And there are many more instances in the narrative, but these instances illustrate the historical brutality that slaves experienced, right? And that's a historical context that our students need to understand. Because what we'll get to in the 3rd thing that I like to emphasize is so we have the historical aspect of Douglas. This work is historical document. This work is literary document. And then this work is spiritual document. Right? And this brutality is important for spirituality because this brutality is sanctioned by many Christian churches during this time. And we have to be willing to confront that, even still today. We have to be willing to confront that. But I'll elaborate more on what Douglas says about it as we move forward. So the second aspect of historical, of this as a historical document, is the dehumanization. And this dehumanization occurs on 2 levels. You have the first level, where Douglas at one point talks about valuation, where slaves are valued as cattle, right? And they're brought in like cattle, and are the price is put upon them, right? So there's that clear physical dehumanization, taking away their human aspects, treating them like animals. But then you have the more mental, spiritual aspects of dehumanization that occurs in moments where there is existential uncertainty created in a slave's life by their white owners. Right? And the existential uncertainty is largely revolves around, first, that separation from parents. Right? That takes away identity. That takes away a rootedness, right, that many people take for granted. Another way is this existential uncertainty about not knowing who to trust. Right? That Douglas gives a few instances when he was a slave of Colonel Lloyd testing his slaves. Right? So Colonel Lloyd, one of his first owners, would stop a slave and say, who's your owner? How's he treating you? And if the slave said anything amiss, that slave would be sold further south as punishment. Another instance is Covey, who is noted as a slave breaker, and Covey, Douglas describes as hiding and hearing what slaves are saying so that he could jump out and surprise them. Right? And this has such an effect on Douglas that when he talks about his escape and his time in the North later on in the text, the effect it has on him is it robs him of his ability to trust anyone that he meets out of fear that they could sell him out and put him back into slavery. So there's one instance where he says, "Trust no man." Right? I can't trust anybody here because of the laws that are in place that allow him to be sold back to the South if he is captured. And that's dehumanization on the level that it robs you of your ability to trust and robs you of your ability to truly connect with people, because there is no rootedness of trust in people. So let's see, another passage, which one of these do I want to? At page 822 in this version I have, this would be chapter 5 in the narrative, fairly early on, in which he writes, "We were not regularly allowanced. Our food was coarse corn meal boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called. Like so many pigs, and like so many pigs they would come and devour the mush. Some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied." Right? So there's that clear dehumanization where he says the children are treated like pigs, or fed like pigs. So we also have this constant criticism of the assumption of white supremacy on the part of those who own slaves. And he points not only to the South, but also points to the North. And he does this in particular in the appendix, where he recognizes that people have read his work and thought him anti-Christian because he criticizes the Christian church so much. And he wants to set the record straight and says, well, no, I don't, I love the Christ of mercy. I love the Christ of the Bible, but the Christians and the way they practice and condone and uphold slavery, and he says in the South and in the North, are problems. This is a major problem, and uses satire to criticize that assumption of white superiority and the use of the Bible to support that. And I also think it's important to talk about Douglas a bit biographically as not only an important figure in the abolitionist movement. Of course, he's a very important figure in the abolitionist movement. He's also important in the procurement of women's rights in the 19th century. The famous Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, Douglas attends that, and is a vocal proponent of women's suffrage in the 19th century throughout the entirety of his life. So, the narrative as a historical document, I think, is an important place to start with the narrative. But it's also important to see the narrative as a literary document, because it is full of literary art. Right? It is a beautiful piece of writing, and a beautiful piece of literature, and it is partaking in many different traditions, and particularly American literature. So it part and parcel comes out of what are famously called in the 17th and 18th centuries captivity and conversion narratives. Particularly, the most famous of these is the Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, a Puritan woman who is taken away by Native Americans and remains with them for a period of time. So this narrative fits in that. There's also the American autobiographical tradition, and I want to point to one particular passage that has something of a callback to Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, as most autobiographies are not solely a story about a person's life, but they are the shaping of that life to tell a larger story. It's almost allegorical, to go back to the discussion that we had about allegory during the discussion of Tolkien. That it serves allegorically, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography does, as sort of the story of America. So there's this famous passage early on when he arrives at Philadelphia, and he talks about how he arrived at Philadelphia with nothing but 2 bread loaves, or arrived with money in his pocket. With that money, he bought these 2 bread loaves and was carrying them around Philadelphia. And that was all he had. And that was all Benjamin Franklin was. And then he turned into Benjamin Franklin. He turned from a guy who was carrying 2 bread loaves into Benjamin Franklin. And this is clearly meant to evoke a certain sort of American ideal, right? This ideal of, through hard work and ingenuity, you become something. And Douglas is taking that, but he's also he's adding that reality that Franklin ignores in the autobiography. Now, Franklin comes to not ignore it in some of his essays and in his personal life, but in his autobiography ignores that real experience of those who are not able to share in those rights, that of slaves. But Douglas, many argue, and this is in chapter. There goes that. This is in chapter. Chapter 11, and he has just escaped to his freedom. And he writes, "I have been frequently asked how I felt when I found myself in a free state. I have never been able to answer the question with any satisfaction to myself. It was a moment of the highest excitement I ever experienced. I suppose I felt as one may imagine an unarmed mariner to feel when he is rescued by a friendly man of war from the pursuit of a pirate. In writing to a dear friend immediately after my arrival to New York, I said I felt like one who had escaped the den of hungry lions. This state of mind very soon subsided, and I was again seized with a feeling of great insecurity and loneliness. I was yet liable to be taken back and subject to all the tortures of slavery. This in itself was enough to damp the ardor of my enthusiasm, but the loneliness overcame me. There I was in the midst of thousands and yet a perfect stranger, without home and without friends, in the midst of thousands of my own brethren, children of a common father, and yet I dared not to unfold to any one of them my sad condition. I was afraid to speak to anyone for fear of speaking to the wrong one, and thereby falling into the hands of money-loving kidnappers, whose business it was to lie in wait for the panting fugitive, as the ferocious beasts of the forest lie in wait for their prey. The motto which I adopted when I started from slavery was this: trust no man. And I was referring to this passage earlier, but this is evocative of that Benjamin Franklin arriving in Philadelphia with 2 bread loaves. But Douglas is showing here in his arrival with nothing, that not only does he have nothing, but he also doesn't have the trust of as he phrases it, children of a common father. And we also have this example of what I'll talk about here in a few minutes of Douglas using irony, where here he reverses that role, where earlier he described the slaves being treated as pigs. Here he treats the slave hunters as animals, as predators seeking prey. So he's reversing that humanization. This is an example of Douglas's, you could call it a dark humor. This runs throughout the narrative and it runs throughout his work, a sort of dark humor and a satire, of reversing these roles in his narrative. So, and we also have this work as what is called a Bildungsroman. It's a coming of age. It is a journey from innocence and being unaware of his particular station in the universe to growing into that awareness and then finding a way to fight back against what he realizes he is. And a few of the important passages that particularly illustrate this in chapter 6. He is being taught the basics of reading by Mrs. Old. And we'll talk about more here in a second. He's being taught the basics of reading by Mrs. Old. And it's only then when she is instructed to quit teaching him that he has a full epiphany of his station, of who he is. Right? That he comes out of that innocence that he has and becomes aware. He writes, these words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things, with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. So he has this epiphany of who he is, right? But he struggles with it in the narrative, right? As any character, right, in this sort of traditional way of telling a story, struggles from innocence to experience, right? But this moment is necessary because it lays out his pathway, right? This realization of who he is. And he elaborates on this in chapter 7, in this passage in which he begins to detest his learning, where it's ecclesiastical, really, where he says, this knowledge, this learning to read, has only brought me sorrow. And he's writing about this point in his journey, where he's reaching a low point, right? This ebb and flow of hope and despair that happens in the life of the slave, and especially in Douglas's account here, a slave who is aware of his condition, right? That this knowledge only creates sorrow, right? But the part of this coming of age journey is the resilience of fighting back against those circumstances, and that manifests itself in one of the most famous passages in the work, and that's the fight with Covey, who is set up as a slave breaker, one of the crudest, cruelest men who has a reputation for taking slaves who are difficult and turning them into more compliant slaves. And this is Douglas's main antagonist, that he acknowledges that Covey nearly succeeds. And there's this moment that is a beautiful literary moment, right, to talk about his blending of romanticism and realism. On one hand, we have this realism with the description of Denby that I read earlier, but then we have this romanticism in this really a climactic point of the novel, where he prepares for this fight with Covey and when he's setting the stage for it. And he is broken down and he's nearly ready to give up. And he looks out on the Chesapeake Bay and sees these ships that are at sail, and is moved by it, and makes a prayer to God. Right? It's about a page and a half, so I don't want to read the whole page and a half, but it's a very powerful passage. Right? And then we have a clear turning point after he makes this prayer to God. Right? He finds his resolve in this darkest moment in his time as a slave. And I'll just read the first few lines of this paragraph that illustrates this. It's in chapter 10. It says, I've already intimated that my condition was much worse during the first 6 months of my stay at Mr. Covey's than in the last 6. The circumstances leading to the change in Mr. Covey's course toward me form an epoch in my humble history. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall now see how a slave was made a man. Right? And that sentence is like the climactic point where, he has made that turning point. Right? It's no longer ebb and flow mentally. It is now full resolve to seek his freedom. And after this, he describes this fight with Covey. And in the American context of American literature, there's this popular idea, it's called regeneration through violence. And this fight with Covey illustrates Douglas's resolve and illustrates his regeneration through this violent act, of fighting back against Covey, who represents this entire institution of slavery. So I'm talking a lot. Are there any questions or comments at this point?
So when you're teaching this in your class, practically, are you providing students with some of these ideas sort of before they read them or after they read them?
I usually assign them pre-reading questions. Now, I don't require that they answer them, but I do strongly encourage them to look at them, because that usually is a preview for the kinds of things I'm going to ask and the kinds of things I'm going to talk about. And as far as, we normally teach this in Western Civ, which is our team taught course with history. So they're also getting the full historical context of 19th century, and before 19th century, of chattel slavery in the United States. And so they have that. They have a very, through the history, they have a very clear context of the time in which Douglas is writing. So does that answer your question?
Okay. I find it absolutely interesting that in AP language class I'm teaching, how we have used Douglas as, especially the blessings of liberal education, just this extraordinary piece of rhetoric. But what I found is you're trying to teach them antithesis and parallelism and things like that. They're so wrapped up in the language of them. I mean, we did like people like Banneker and Zachariah, other things, a million pieces it seems. But when we stopped and really looked at Frederick Douglass, it seems like they just couldn't get enough of the diction, the syntax, the style. It was just a real turning moment. And then the spirituality of his writing too. It's just built in. But so I've taught it as a literary piece, but now I'm teaching it as a rhetorical piece. But it's interesting that the literary essence of it just keeps rising right through it. It holds itself, like you said. It really does.
Yeah, and because I think it is important to discuss the rhetorical aspects of Douglas's writing as well. Yeah.
July 4th speech.
Yes, and because I can safely assume that I teach the 19th century American literature class here, and because I can safely assume that most of them have taken Civ and have read the narrative, we read What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which I am going to reference here in a moment, and talk about that more rhetorically than maybe as a work of literature or as a work of history.
I gave them a piece. We just finished a piece from Alice Walker, Our Mother's Gardens, and just without me having to even prompt them, parallels went right to Douglas. It was just, so thank you for that.
Anything else?
The sentence that sticks in my mind that illustrates that kind of rhetorical prowess, and it's the turning point you're talking about, I think. You have seen how a man becomes a slave.
Yes.
Now I will show you how a slave becomes a man.
And they get that. Excuse me. But they get that. Students get it. You don't have to. You say, okay, this is the rhetorical term, and it seems like it sticks. And they can see other things like Martin Luther King uses it a great deal. But the point is that the literary aspect. I'm not really teaching the literature. I want to. But it's like, let's get this. We have to get the rhetoric down. But it just kind of blossoms through, surfaces through all the time. And we'll just linger on the words. And if you want to teach diction, and syntax, it's just
Yeah, the research I'm doing currently is a lot of Mark Twain and a lot of his particularly criticism that he has done. And he as a critic, Mark Twain, put such an emphasis on finding the right word in the right time. Right. So the writers he likes are the ones he perceives.
Right.
To be able to choose the right word at the right time and say it in the right way. A certain economy, and has no time for people who don't choose the right word.
The right word.
And
the lightning bug, he calls it.
Yeah.
The lightning bug that choosing the right word is like distinguishing between the light and the lightning bug.
Yeah.
Like which one I am.
Yeah, and Douglas is a writer who chooses the right word. Yeah. So so as a coming of age, right, that this awakening into awareness of who he is and growing up and growing into a sense of manhood, right, and asserting his own independence, right, because he still has to escape after he fights Cubby, but for all intents and purposes, the fight with Cubby represents his freedom of will, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, this work is important in the context of abolitionism as an abolitionist piece of literature, published in 1845. I'd like to do a little bit of discussion about that as well. This blending of romanticism and realism that I've been touching on as I've been talking about these passages, because again, on one hand, you have those very brutal descriptions that fit in literary realism, but then you have these romantic flourishes where he's describing these sailboats on the Chesapeake Bay, right? And this striving to do more and to be more, right, is very evocative of the romantic in American literature. And finally, I like to touch a little bit in this as a literary work on irony, wit, and satire, because it's really easy for students to miss this, that Douglas does have jokes, right, and usually jokes at the expense of his owners. A good example of this is early in the narrative. In chapter 1, toward the end of it, he says, I've had two masters. My first master's name was Anthony. I do not remember his first name. He was generally called Captain Anthony, a title which I presume he acquired by sailing a craft on the Chesapeake Bay. And this is meant to be a joke, right, that he's poking fun at this sort of puppy Southern aristocracy, or the Southern attempt at aristocracy, where really Anthony just took his dad's boat out on the Chesapeake Bay, sailed it, and then went home and called himself a captain. So he's poking fun at that very clearly, making a joke at Anthony's expense, right? Deflating his authority. Right, and in the world of African American criticism, this is called signifying, that he's destabilizing those authoritative barriers by referring to them in this way. We have another example in this book on 827. It would be in chapter 827, chapter 7, where he is trying not to impugn people who have helped him along the way, right? Because he does give examples of people who have been sympathetic toward his condition, white people who have been sympathetic toward his condition. Right? But in doing that and trying to protect their identities, he gets a nice shot in at the southern and northern churches that support slavery, where he writes, I'm strongly tempted to give the names of 2 or 3 of those little boys as a testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear them. But prejudice forbids, not that it would injure me, but that it might embarrass them, for it is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. Mm-hmm. Now that's, again, more, right, it's not a joke that's meant to make us laugh as an audience, right? It's more of a satirical commentary on the state of the church, of the American church that supports slavery. We also see this in the appendix, where we have this appendix at the end in which he clarifies his stance on Christianity, and even writes a parody song of a popular hymn that was sung in churches during this time, that explodes, right, this notion of what the title of the song, I think, is Heavenly Union, right, that people who own slaves, right, would sing this hymn called Heavenly Union, right, and what he does is he ends the narrative with this parody of this song and shows literally what they are doing to slaves as they sing about Heavenly Union. So I'll just read maybe one or two stanzas from it to illustrate. Come saints and sinners, hear me tell how pious peace whip Jack and Nell, and women buy and children sell, and preach all sinners down to hell, and sing of Heavenly Union. And they'll bleat and baa and Donna like goats, gorge down black sheep and strain at moats, array their backs in fine black coats, then seize their Negroes by their throats and choke for Heavenly Union. And so he's literalizing what is being done to slaves, and with this refrain of Heavenly Union throughout to attack. I mean, this is a satire and an attack on the church and its role in propping up slavery. And also another example of this that I wanted to point to, where he directly talks about his use of satire, is that essay, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, in which at the end of it, I'm going to get out my other book here, in which at the end of it, he says, at a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not the light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. And this is a nice segue into Douglass as a literary figure, because we've talked about together as one of the greatest writers in American literature and in all literature. But he's also very important in what is essentially a continuing recognition by slaves, by African Americans, of this journey from slavery to equality. And he is referenced even when people aren't aware that he's being referenced, right? So one example of this, of Douglass as an important literary figure in which African Americans are calling back, right? The poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, who writes in the late 19th, early 20th century, has a sonnet called Douglass that is based upon the Wordsworthian sonnet about Milton. Right? Milton, wouldest thou? I can't remember word for word what it is, but where he's evoking Milton, to the spirit of Milton to come back. Right? Dunbar is doing that for Douglass. Right? Douglass, we need you, right? And we need your power. We also see, as I read this paragraph, where he says, "For it is not the light that is needed, but fire." Right? I think of James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time. Could he potentially be referencing Douglass in that? And he's also referencing the Bible, but is he evoking the speech by Douglass in doing that? And most recently, at the most recent inauguration, African American poet laureate, teenage poet laureate, youth poet laureate, referenced Douglass in her poem. Right, so this is part of a tradition, right? An African American literary tradition, where there is this clear passing, of this literary tradition, and it's not that they always agree on what need to be done. It's not, but there is a unity of experience, a unity of shared suffering, and a recognition of the collective suffering that African Americans have had in American history, in American life. And that's a good segue, I find, to talk about the spiritual aspects. Where am I at on time? Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take this long. This calling to account in the appendix, those who use the Bible to justify slavery. In chapter it's chapter 9. He writes, I have said my master found religious sanction for his cruelty. As an example, I will state one of many facts to prove the charge. I have seen him tie up a lame young woman and whip her with a heavy cow skin upon her naked shoulders, causing the warm and red blood to drip, and in justification of the bloody deed, he would quote this passage of Scripture, He that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes. And this is a reference to Luke 12:47. So this use of the Bible to justify the cruelties of slavery, he's calling that out directly. He also makes note throughout the text that Christian slave owners are the worst. That when he finds that a slave owner has been converted, he worries because they're going to be worse now than they were before. There's a special cruelty done by Christian slave owners. This misappropriation of slave songs that he discusses early on in the narrative, where he, the justification for slavery that many slave owners would make would be, oh, well, the songs they sing represent happiness, right? But he's correcting that account and saying, no, slaves sing when they're at their most sorrowful. And we have these examples of God's providence in the text, where he references God's providence. And I did not mark a page for that. And now I see why I marked pages for the others. It's at the very end of chapter 5, where he writes, I may be deemed superstitious and even egotistical in regarding this event as a special interposition of the divine providence in my favor, but I should be false to the earliest sentiments of my soul if I suppress the opinion. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace, and in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of faith and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained like ministering angels to cheer me through the gloom. This good spirit was from God, and to him I offer thanksgiving and praise. So here is what he's referring to, as he does in the appendix, as Jesus, as is depicted in the Bible, right? And to look at that passage, to give some clarity to that, when he writes, says, what I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible references to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessary to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. And this is where, I think it's important, for our students in today's culture, because it's really easy to read someone like Douglas, or even to read someone like Baldwin and think, oh, okay, well, yeah, that's wonderful, but we're done now, right? Slavery's over. There's nothing left to deal with, right? And this is where I think that spiritual aspect of Douglas's narrative comes into play, that we have to ask ourselves, even in the church today, especially a church that is largely still segregated, right? Where you don't typically see white people worship with African Americans. That we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And we have to do the hard work internally as a church and as Christians about the extent to which, even though no, there is no slavery, right? That there is no chattel slavery, right? Yes, that was made illegal, right? But to what extent are the tentacles of that sin still manifest in our culture today? Right, that's the hard work, and I think that's the work that our students, when we're presenting a work like Douglas, need to hear.